The morning sun peeked through our bedroom blinds, casting golden lines across the floor like silent alarms. My wife Andrea was already up, her robe tied tight as she stood at the kitchen window sipping coffee and watching a squirrel raid our bird feeder. It was a normal Saturday until she unfolded the bright orange envelope left on our doorstep. The lettering was bold, unmistakably official looking. An HOA violation notice. The charge: unapproved front yard alterations, which apparently included the new lavender plants Andrea had planted by the walkway. I joined her, coffee in hand, scanning the notice like it was a bad grade on a report card. Andrea frowned, rereading it. Twice, then 3 times. They didn't even leave a warning, she said, her voice low, more baffled than angry. The fine was a steep $2,500, an absurd number for a handful of plants that had already drawn compliments from neighbors. Weed. Moved into this neighborhood precisely for its charm and supposed sense of community, not bureaucratic pettiness. This was the first time the HOA had flexed its power so harshly. And we were their target. We sat down at the kitchen island, phones out, looking up the HOA rules and regulations posted on their website. Andrea scrolled through PDF after PDF, her finger tapping impatiently on the screen. Nowhere does it say anything about lavender, she muttered. The language in the landscaping section was vague, maintain neighborhood aesthetics, whatever that meant. I could feel the pressure building behind her calm demeanor. Andrea wasn't one to let injustice slide, and she had the perfect combination of grace and grit to challenge it. Later that day, we decided to pay a visit to the HOA office, located just 2 blocks away. A small stucco building that tried to look welcoming but reeked of passive aggression. We walked in, notice in hand, and were met with the sight of Karen. Her name tag read HOA Vice Chair, but it could have just said Warden. Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she looked us up and down. Andrea introduced herself politely, asking about the violation. Karen barely glanced at the notice before interrupting. The fine stands. You should have submitted a landscape alteration form. But there was no change to the layout, Andrea replied, keeping her voice calm. Lavender is a plant, not a structure. Karen's tone turned condescending, as though she were talking to a child caught stealing cookies. Rules are rules, she chirped, her fingers drumming on the desk. Andrea's eyes narrowed just a touch. Subtle, but I recognized that spark. This wasn't about flowers anymore. It was about respect, and Karen had just poked the wrong bear. I put a hand on Andrea's back, grounding her, silently letting her know I was with her. We left without resolution. Karen had refused to waive or even reduce the fine, her voice stiff with authority. As we walked back home, Andrea was already strategizing. I'm going to submit a formal appeal, she said, pulling out her phone and typing notes. I'll request documentation for every fine they've issued in the last year. If this is how they treat homeowners, it needs to be exposed. I admired her focus. It reminded me of her courtroom manner. Andrea wasn't just my wife. She was also a magistrate judge, and if anyone knew how to handle misuse of power, it was her. Karen had no idea who she was messing with. That night, over dinner, we talked through possible outcomes. Could fight the fine through the HOA's appeals process, which was notoriously slow and often biased. Or we could take it public, involve the neighborhood Facebook group, maybe even contact the local news if it escalated. Let's start with the internal process, Andrea said, always the tactician. Give them the chance to do the right thing before we burn down the house. Metaphorically. I nodded. It was the calm before the storm, and we both sensed it. Over the next few days, Andrea prepared her appeal, drafting it with the precision of a legal motion. She cited sections of the HOA guidelines, noting the lack of clarity and the inconsistency. In enforcement, she even included pictures of neighboring homes with similar plants that had never been fined. Her tone was firm but professional, the kind that couldn't be ignored. She submitted the appeal via certified mail and email, making sure it was received. Then we waited. While waiting, Karen didn't waste any time. She sent 2 more notices, one for a supposed overgrown shrub and another for excessive decorative items on our porch, which included a single pumpkin and a welcome mat. It was obvious retaliation. Andrea logged every notice, took time-stamped photos, and documented each interaction. This is starting to look like harassment, she said. One evening, filing everything into a folder she titled HOA Nonsense. I could tell she was getting angrier, but she stayed composed. Her control only made her more dangerous. We received a response 2 weeks later, a formal rejection of the appeal. No explanation beyond a boilerplate paragraph about rule enforcement and community standards. Andrea stared at the letter for a long moment before letting out a slow breath. "All right," she said, standing. "Now we escalate." She began drafting a complaint to the state HOA regulatory board and copied in the neighborhood's city council rep. The gloves were off. Karen, still clueless, kept pushing. The breaking point came on a Friday morning when Andrea went outside to water the plants and found 2 police officers walking up the driveway. One of them looked awkward, the other stern. Karen had apparently called them, claiming Andrea had become hostile and was harassing HOA staff. It was a blatant abuse of emergency services. I grabbed my phone and started recording. As Andrea walked toward them with her hands visible, calm but curious. "Good morning, officers. How can I help you?" she asked. The younger officer's face changed the moment she spoke. Recognition dawned like a sunrise. "Ma'am," he said, shifting his stance. "Judge Ramirez." Andrea nodded. "Yes, I presided over your swearing-in ceremony last March, didn't I?" Looking both respectful and embarrassed. Karen, who had followed them up, the sidewalk froze in place. Her eyes flicked between the officer and Andrea like a deer realizing it had walked into a trap. I could hardly suppress a grin. Andrea calmly explained the situation, outlining the notices, the appeal, the rejections, and the pattern of behavior. The older officer took notes while the younger one nodded along. "This sounds like a civil issue, not a police matter," he said after listening. "Exactly," Andrea replied, "and I'd appreciate if this misuse of your department's time was noted somewhere." They both agreed. Karen's face was flushed with something between rage and humiliation. She turned on her heel and stormed off. After the police left, Andrea finally allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. "I didn't even have to say anything," she said, just showed up and let the truth speak for itself. She wasn't gloating, just acknowledging the small justice that had finally broken through the nonsense. We went back inside, knowing the war wasn't over, but at least we'd won a major battle. Karen would think twice before dialing 911 again. Andrea made sure of it. The incident spread fast through the neighborhood. Someone had seen the police arrive, and word traveled quickly. By evening, we had a dozen texts and 2 invites to the neighborhood Facebook group, where the story had already sparked a debate. Some residents sided with Karen, but most were fed up with the HOA's overreach. Screenshots of similar fines. Passive-aggressive emails and horror stories filled the thread. Andrea watched quietly, occasionally replying with calm, factual information. She didn't need to shout. The truth had its own volume. One neighbor, an older gentleman named Marcus, stopped by the next day with a tray of muffins and a handshake. "Been waiting for someone to stand up to them," he said. "Didn't." "No, it'd be you too. Good on you." Others followed suit, sharing stories and offering support. It turned out Karen had a long history of power trips and petty punishments, but no one had dared fight back. Andrea had cracked the dam. Now, it was only a matter of time before the flood of accountability followed, and Karen was in its path. That Sunday, Andrea received an email from another HOA board member, this one much more diplomatically worded. It invited her to attend the next HOA meeting and present her concerns formally. We both read it twice. "Sounds like they're finally ready to talk," I said. Andrea nodded, or they're trying to cover their backs before the city. Council gets involved. Either way, we were going. And Andrea was preparing her remarks like opening statements in court, clear, composed, and absolutely bulletproof. As she practiced in front of the mirror, I watched her with admiration. This was who she was, unshakable, razor-sharp, and quietly powerful. Karen had mistaken her for just another homeowner to push around. Big mistake. This wasn't over, but it was turning. The first chapter of our HOA saga had been written. In Lavender and Law, and the next one would be even better. Because now Andrea wasn't just reacting. She was leading. And Karen? Karen was officially on notice. The community center was quieter than usual as we walked in, Andrea's binder tucked neatly under her arm. A few residents were already seated, whispering in hushed tones, their eyes flicking between the chairs. And the HOA board table like a prelude to a courtroom drama. Karen was already there, arms crossed, her usual smug smile replaced by something tight and brittle. The rest of the board members avoided eye contact with her. Andrea scanned the room, her eyes calm but alert, and took her seat near the front. I sat beside her, feeling a quiet current of energy buzz through the crowd. This wasn't just another HOA meeting. This felt like the beginning of a reckoning. Several neighbors gave Andrea small nods or thumbs up as she passed. Gaw, Karen avoided. Looking our way, her eyes fixed on her notes. The meeting was called to order by the HOA president, a balding man named Thomas, who cleared his throat nervously. We'll start with homeowner concerns, he said, and Andrea stood, her presence commanding silence. She stepped to the microphone and opened her binder with calm precision. Good evening. I'm Judge Andrea Ramirez, homeowner at 411 Cedar Ridge, she began, her voice steady and clear. I'm here to address the fines issued to our property and the pattern of arbitrary enforcement by this HOA board, specifically by Vice Chair Karen McNulty. A few heads turned sharply at the directness. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. Andrea continued, presenting photos, citing bylaws, and laying out the timeline of events like a seasoned litigator. Every point she made was supported by documentation, photos with timestamps, HOA rule excerpts, and records of similar properties with no citations. We were fined $2,500 without prior notice, despite no explicit rule violation, Andrea said, pointing to a highlighted clause. We appealed through the appropriate channels and were denied with no clear justification. Then we were subjected. 2 additional citations that can only be interpreted as retaliatory. Her tone never rose. She didn't need to shout. The facts did the shouting. Karen shifted in her seat, arms tightening across her chest, eyes darting across the room as murmurs began to grow louder. One board member whispered to another, clearly uncomfortable. Andrea wrapped up with a final point. This board has a responsibility not only to enforce rules, but to do so with transparency, fairness, and respect for due process, none of which I've seen in recent actions. She stepped back from the mic. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was reverent. The room had heard her. The HOA president stammered a response, trying to regain control of the narrative. Thank you, Judge Ramirez. The board will, take your comments under advisement. But the momentum had shifted. One by one, other residents stood up. Marcus spoke next, followed by a young mom from 3 houses down. Each had their own story of Karen's overreach, sudden fines, unexplained warnings, or ignored emails. One woman even produced an email where Karen mocked her for not understanding the rules. The meeting stretched on as more voices joined. The board began looking less like authority figures and more like defendants at trial. Andrea listened quietly, occasionally nodding in support, but never interrupting. Her statement had been the catalyst. Now the community was carrying the torch. By the end, Thomas promised to review all recent enforcement actions for consistency. Karen sat silently, her earlier authority crumbling by the second, no longer feared, now simply exposed. After the meeting, a small crowd formed around. Andrea thanking her, asking questions, and offering support. She smiled graciously, careful not to gloat or take credit for everything. I just spoke up, she said. You all carried it from there. Karen exited quickly through a side door, her usual wave conspicuously absent. That night, our porch light flickered with the glow of solidarity muffins from Marcus, a thank you note from the neighbor with the pumpkin, and even a hand-drawn card from a child that read, "You're my hero." The next morning, the neighborhood Facebook group exploded with praise. Someone had live-streamed the meeting, and clips of Andrea's speech were being shared like wildfire. Finally, someone stood up. One comment read, "She put Karen in her place without even raising her voice." Andrea scrolled through the comments with a quiet smile. I knew she wasn't in it for fame or drama. She just couldn't ignore injustice. But still, it was satisfying to see her strength recognized. Karen's silence online said everything. Later that week, we received a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a formal apology from the board, statement of policy review, and notice that the $2,500 fine had been revoked. All pending violations against your property have been dismissed, it concluded. Andrea read it aloud, then folded it carefully and placed it in her binder. Good, she said simply. That's a start. But we both knew this wasn't just about us anymore. It had become something bigger, a movement toward accountability. Karen's position on the board became voluntarily vacated 2 weeks later. No public announcement, just a quiet removal of her name from the HOA website. We heard through the grapevine she was furious, blaming a smear campaign and threatening to sue, though nothing ever came of it. The board held a special election for her replacement, and for the first time, several candidates stepped forward. Andrea didn't run. She didn't want the seat. But she did attend the candidate forum and asked the toughest questions. With Karen gone, the board's tone changed dramatically. The next few meetings were productive, even civil. The new vice chair, a retired teacher named Elaine, reached out to Andrea for help rewriting the landscaping guidelines. We need clarity, she admitted.
Ow!
And we need someone who knows how to draft enforceable rules. Andrea agreed to consult, not as an enforcer, but as a protector of fairness. Her legal expertise now served as a guardrail, not a sword. The community began to heal. Our lavender plants stayed. No one mentioned them again, except to compliment how nice they looked when they bloomed. Andrea added a small bench beside them, where she often sat in the evenings with her tea and a book. Neighbors would pass and wave, some stopping to chat. The garden had gone from a battlefield to a gathering place. Every time I saw someone pause to admire the flowers, I felt a quiet pride, not just in the plants, but in the stand we'd taken. And in Andrea, the woman who made it happen, summer rolled into fall, and with it came cooler evenings and calmer streets. The HOA, now humbled and restructured, issued a new community charter that emphasized transparency, communication, and homeowner involvement. Andrea helped edit the final draft, and when it was passed, the applause at the meeting felt more like celebration than ceremony. Change had come not easily, but decisively. And it all started because someone refused to accept the unacceptable. One evening, as we sat on the bench watching the sunset, I asked Andrea if she'd do anything differently. She thought for a moment, then shook her head. No, she said. Sometimes it takes a fire to clear out the weeds. Her words hung in the air like poetry. She didn't seek battles, but she didn't shy from them either. And now, thanks to her quiet strength, our neighborhood was better. Not perfect, but better. And far more aware of who really holds the power when justice meets persistence. Karen never apologized directly, but she did move out a few months later, listing her home with little fanfare. The sign went up one morning, and by evening, neighbors were already speculating. Can't take the heat, someone muttered during an evening walk. Or the lavender, another joked. Andrea didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Justice had already spoken. And with every bloom in our garden, it continued to say, just enough. Chapter 2 had closed, not with confrontation, but with transformation. What started as a petty fine became a catalyst for reform, respect, and a reminder that no one is above accountability, especially not those who wield power without humility. In a world of Karens, sometimes it only takes one Andrea to set things right. And this neighborhood would never forget that, because justice, like lavender, grows best when nurtured and fiercely protected. Life returned to a quiet rhythm after Karen's departure, but echoes of her reign still lingered in whispered conversations and shared glances at community events. The new HOA board had made real strides in reform, but trust once broken takes time to rebuild. Andrea's role had shifted from instigator to guardian, a quiet force keeping the board honest and the residents informed. Every so often, someone would stop by with a question about a notice or a request for advice. Andrea always listened. The lavender garden had become symbolic more than a cluster of plants. It was a statement. One afternoon, a local reporter stopped by after hearing about the HOA shakeup and asked to do a feature. Andrea agreed, on one condition: this isn't about me. It's about accountability. The article, published a week later, titled "The Lavender Rebellion," and quickly gained traction online. People from other neighborhoods reached out, sharing their own HOA nightmares. Andrea's inbox overflowed with stories. It was a crisp Saturday morning when the first letter from another community arrived. A woman named Cheryl from a town 2 hours away had seen the article and sent a handwritten note. She described a similar problem: vindictive HOA chair fining families for minor offenses and ignoring appeals. "Your story gave me courage." The letter read, "I'm planning to speak at our next board meeting." Andrea smiled softly as she read it aloud, then pinned it on the fridge. "Looks like we've started something," she said. The influx of messages sparked an idea. Andrea began compiling the stories into a blog. Anonymizing details but highlighting patterns. Abuse of power, consistent enforcement, and homeowners unaware of their rights. She titled it "Behind the Gates" and updated it weekly. Began as a personal battle, transformed into a platform for advocacy. Sharing links and HOA reform groups, began citing her blog. It became clear that our lavender garden wasn't just blooming, it was spreading seeds. The blog's growing influence attracted attention, some supportive, some wary. Andrea received an invitation to speak at a regional housing conference, hosted by a coalition for ethical HOA governance. She was hesitant at first, unsure if she wanted to step further into the spotlight. "Don't have to lead a revolution." I told her, "Just keep being the voice of reason you've always been." That seemed to settle it. Andrea accepted the invitation, and we booked a weekend trip to attend the event at the conference. Andrea was poised and precise, sharing her experience with a mix of humility and sharp insight. Her panel drew the largest crowd, and during the Q&A, dozens lined up to ask how to navigate their own HOA dilemmas. Some shared horror stories of fines for chalk art, front porch plants, or even holiday lights. Andrea didn't offer grand solutions. Just practical steps: read your bylaws, document everything, and never assume silence means guilt. The audience hung on her every word. That evening, we celebrated with a quiet dinner at a nearby restaurant. Andrea sipped her wine, looking contemplative, but peaceful. "I never imagined all this would come from a few plants," she said. I laughed, raising my glass. "You planted more than lavender, you know." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the flicker of candlelight. This wasn't just about change, it was about legacy. And Andrea's legacy was becoming something far bigger than either of us had anticipated. Back home, things continued to evolve. The HOA, now more transparent and community-focused, began hosting open forums and workshops on residents' rights. Andrea helped draft the materials, ensuring the language was clear and the tone respectful. "HOAs don't have to be the enemy," she often said, "but they do have to be accountable." Her words carried weight, and for once, the board listened. Even skeptics who once grumbled about HOA meetings began attending them more often. As spring returned, so did the blossoms, vivid purples and soft greens lining our walkway. Andrea added a new sign to the garden, "Planted with Purpose." It was small and tasteful, but neighbors noticed. Several asked where to get one of their own. Soon, similar signs started popping up along the street, not as protest, but as quiet solidarity. Lavender had become a banner for resilience. And Karen's name, once synonymous with fear, became a cautionary tale of unchecked authority. But not everyone embraced the new order. A few holdouts grumbled about Andrea's influence, calling her too political or too involved. One anonymous letter arrived in our mailbox, accusing her of ruining the neighborhood's traditions. Andrea read it once, then calmly filed it with the rest of her HOA documents. "Change always makes someone uncomfortable," she said. "But discomfort isn't the same as danger." Her composure was unshaken, her mission unchanged. She knew the work was far from over. A surprise came in early summer when the city reached out to Andrea, inviting her to consult on a proposed ordinance involving HOA oversight. The idea was to create standardized practices across neighborhoods. To prevent abuse was the first step towards citywide reform, and they wanted Andrea's help. "They're not asking me to make laws," she clarified. just help them understand what homeowners are facing. It was advisory, but meaningful. Another seed taking root. She attended several council meetings over the next month, always bringing her binder and speaking with clarity and grace. The council appreciated her balanced tone, never accusatory, always constructive. "You don't just identify problems," one councilwoman said. "You bring solutions." Andrea never sought recognition, but it was obvious she had become a respected voice, not just in our neighborhood but across the city. And it all started with one unfair fine and a refusal to back down. One evening, we walked the neighborhood like we often did, hand in hand as the sky shifted from gold to twilight. A few homes had added new gardens, roses, sunflowers, even vegetables, and many now had Andrea's signature sign. "You've started a quiet movement," I said. She chuckled softly. Funny how something quiet can still be powerful. We paused in front of our garden, the lavender gently swaying in the breeze. It wasn't just about aesthetics anymore. It was about ownership, of land, of rights, of voice. Later that night, Andrea sat on the bench beside the lavender with her laptop, updating the blog. I watched her from the window, the glow of the screen illuminating her face. She was writing something new, an open letter to homeowners everywhere. Not angry, not demanding, just honest. Encouraging others to speak, to organize, to challenge. Unfairness with grace and strategy. Her fingers moved steadily across the keys, as if transcribing purpose straight from her heart. The letter published the next morning. It went viral within hours, shared by advocacy groups, attorneys, and homeowner alliances across the country. "Stand firm, but stand kind," it ended. "Your voice is your greatest tool. Use it well." The comments flooded in, filled with gratitude and shared experiences. Andrea read each one, taking mental notes, occasionally replying. She didn't see herself as a leader, but by then, it was clear she was becoming one. Not loud, not forceful, but undeniable. The final turning point came during the annual HOA community gathering. But this year felt different. Neighbors greeted one another more openly, kids played on the lawn, and even the board seemed relaxed. Andrea was invited to say a few words. She declined at first, then reconsidered. Looked onto the gazebo stage, looked out at the faces familiar, and Yuan spoke simply. This community stood up for itself. I'm proud to be a part of it. The applause wasn't thunderous, it was warm, genuine, earned. When she stepped down, several people came up to thank her. One woman eyes. Misty said, "You gave us our voice back." Andrea smiled, hugged her gently, and replied, "It was always yours. You just needed to use it." And that was the truth. Andrea hadn't changed the rules. She'd reminded people they had a right to question them, a right to challenge injustice, a right to be heard. As summer faded into fall, Andrea continued. Her work quietly, steadily, always focused on fairness. She didn't crave power. She offered perspective. People listened. Our garden remained the same, yet somehow more vibrant, more meaningful. Visitors would pause, read the sign, and ask about the story. And we would tell it not to boast, but to inspire. Because it wasn't just our story anymore. To everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet, in the end, Karen's reign became a footnote. The real story was what followed. A neighborhood that found its voice, a woman who stood tall without raising hers, and a field of lavender that refused to be uprooted. Justice hadn't come loudly. It had bloomed, and its fragrance, soft and persistent, lingered in every corner of our community. The garden grew. And so did we. It had been nearly a year since the lavender garden first became a symbol of something greater. Time moved gently now, like the breeze that passed through the porch on quiet mornings. Andrea's blog continued to grow, its readership, expanding beyond our region and drawing in voices from across the country. Stories poured in heartfelt, painful, and often inspiring. Each one was different, yet they shared a common thread. People reclaiming their right to be heard. Andrea responded to as many messages as she could, offering guidance, encouragement, and in some cases, resources. As a savior only as someone who had walked the path and could offer a steady light. A homeowner from Arizona emailed after winning her appeal against her HOA. Another from Florida shared how her neighborhood had voted out a corrupt board. These victories, large and small, were seeds planted by stories, ones that Andrea had helped cultivate. The city ordinance, Andrea consulted on, passed with overwhelming support. It created a new level of transparency for HOAs and gave homeowners access to a neutral review board for disputes. Andrea was there when it passed, standing quietly at the back of the chamber, watching democracy work the way it was supposed to. The mayor thanked her personally afterward. "You reminded us what public service should be," he said. Andrea nodded, accepting the compliment, but quickly shifted focus back to the work still ahead. Not long after, Andrea received an invitation to testify before the state legislature. The topic was HOA accountability, and her name had been recommended by both the city council and housing advocates. She debated whether to go. It was a big stage, and she valued her privacy. But after some thought, she agreed. "I don't speak now," she said to me one night. "Then who will speak for the ones who can't?" Her voice was steady, her decision clear. We booked the trip. The legislative hearing was held in a large marble hall, filled with officials, activists, and media. Andrea sat at the front, her notes in a tidy folder, her presence calm and collected. When it was her turn to speak, the room fell silent. She told her story not with drama, but with truth. She spoke of abuse masked as authority, of neighbors silenced by fear, and of communities stronger when residents are empowered. When she finished, several legislators stood to applaud. The message had landed. Andrea's testimony made headlines. "Judge speaks out for homeowners' rights," read one headline. "The Lavender Advocate," read another. She gave no interviews, choosing instead to post a simple message on her blog. "I am grateful for the chance to speak. I hope more of you will too." It wasn't about her. It never was. But her quiet leadership was starting to shift systems. What began on a front lawn had now reached the halls of state power. Still, she remained grounded in her purpose. Meanwhile, our neighborhood continued to evolve. The HOA held annual elections, and this time, voter turnout doubled. New residents were more engaged. Meetings were lively, but respectful. And Andrea's role, while unofficial, remained influential. People trusted her not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. She listened, she advised. She never lorded her experience over anyone. Instead, she encouraged others to take the reins of their own advocacy. One day, a high school civics teacher from the area asked if Andrea would speak to her class. She hesitated at first, unsure if teenagers would connect with HOA issues, but the teacher insisted. "It's about civic engagement, not plants." Andrea agreed, and the students were surprisingly attentive. She spoke not just about the HOA saga, but about using your voice, reading the fine print, and standing firm when something feels wrong. When she finished, one student asked, "How do I know when it's worth fighting?" Andrea smiled and gave the answer she'd learned firsthand. "If it affects your peace, your dignity, or your right, it's worth it." Wrote to say that the students hadn't stopped talking about her visit. Some even started a project to review their school's code of conduct. Change, once again, was in bloom. It wasn't flashy or viral. It was quiet, steady, and deeply rooted. And it all came from a story shared at the right time by the right voice. Back at home, Andrea added another section to her blog, resources for students and young adults. Civic Basics, she called it. It covered everything from reading local laws to writing effective emails to elected officials. They shouldn't have to wait until something goes wrong to learn how to speak up, she said. The page became one of the most visited on the site. Even parents emailed, thanking her for making complex topics understandable. Advocacy wasn't just for adults anymore. With each passing month, Andrea was invited to more panels, workshops, and discussions. She accepted only a few, careful to guard her energy. "I don't want to burn out," she said. This only works if I can keep going. Her balance was deliberate, staying connected without becoming consumed. In our home remained a sanctuary, a place where lavender bloomed and life felt steady. No matter how far her message reached, she always returned to her roots. The lavender, by now, had spread into a second bed. Andrea added a few white stones between the plants, shaping them into a quiet path. Neighbors often stopped to admire the simple beauty of it. One little girl left a painted rock that read, "Thank you," at the base of the bench. Andrea left it there, untouched. Some things didn't need explanation. They just needed space to be seen. And in our front yard, they had plenty. One afternoon, we received a message from a law school professor in another state who had added Andrea's story to his ethics curriculum. "Real-world examples make the biggest impact," he wrote. Andrea was humbled but hesitant. "It's surreal," she told me. I never set out to be anyone's case study, but she understood the value. Her journey was no longer just a story, it was a blueprint. Proof that small actions rooted in truth could spark wide-reaching change. The seasons turned once again. Trees shed their leaves, the air grew crisp, and the lavender went dormant for the winter. But even in rest, there was growth beneath the soil. Andrea took the season to pause, reflect, and rest. She spent time reading, walking, and sketching out new ideas. "I want to write something more structured," she said one morning. "Maybe a guidebook?" I nodded. The world didn't just need her story, it needed her wisdom, shared plainly and accessible. Sybil. By spring, she had a draft, a slim, clear guide to community advocacy. She titled it Grounded, a Homeowner's Guide to Standing Firm. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't angry. It was simply honest and useful. She self-published it through the blog and offered it as a free download. Within a month, it had been downloaded over 10,000 times. Teachers requested copies, legal aid groups linked to it, and Andrea, ever grounded, went back to planting a few new seedlings by the porch. Her influence continued to grow, not as a viral sensation, but as a reliable voice in a noisy world. She wasn't a disruptor, she was a stabilizer. A reminder that advocacy didn't have to be loud to be powerful. That a single act of resistance, when rooted in dignity, could ripple into real reform. Though Karen's name had long faded, from neighborhood memory, Andrea's presence remained. It's not in control, just quietly in bloom. At the end of the year, the HOA gave Andrea a Community Service Award. She accepted it with a short, gracious speech. "It's not about the fine," she said. "It's about fairness." And with that, she stepped down from the stage and back into the crowd right where she belonged. Part of the people, not above them. A gardener of justice. Still planting, still nurturing, still growing.